Wyoming Territory, 1885. The dust was a constant companion, a fine, golden powder that settled on every surface and swirled in the wind like restless phantoms. From the window of the sheriff's office, Caleb Thorne watched it coat the main street of Redemption, a town that felt more like a temporary argument with the wilderness than a permanent settlement. The name was a bitter irony he tasted every morning with his coffee. There was no redemption here, only survival. The place was a monument to his creed, sparse, orderly, and devoid of anything that was not essential. A desk, a chair, the pot-belly stove that fought a losing battle with the winter cold, and the gun rack on the wall holding his Winchester. The 2 cells in the back were clean, and more often than not, empty. Peace and redemption was a fragile thing, maintained less by the law and more by the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the land that surrounded them. It was a land that swallowed noise, ambition, and men whole. His gaze drifted past the general store and the saloon, to the steel tracks that gleamed under the high, pale sun. The tracks were the town's lifeline, and its only real connection to the world he had long since turned his back on. Twice a week, the train from the east brought mail, supplies, and the occasional foolhardy soul chasing a dream of land or gold. It was a disruption, a brief clamor of steam and steel that tore through the fabric of his carefully constructed quiet. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest whenever he heard its distant whistle, a ghost of a feeling he refused to name. Caleb had built his life like a fortress after the fever took Sarah and little Lily. Each day was a brick laid, each routine a layer of mortar, sealing him away from the kind of pain that could shatter a man like glass against stone. Love, connection, hope, they were liabilities. Attachments were anchors that could drag you under into a sea of grief. A man alone was a man who could move, who could endure, who had nothing left to lose. It was a bleak philosophy, but it had kept him standing. It was all he had. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then it came, a low, mournful cry carried on the wind for miles down the valley. The train. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a summons. Duty required him to be there. He was the law, and the arrival of strangers was always a potential spark in the tinder-dry reality of the frontier. He took his hat from the peg by the door, the felt worn smooth by years of habit, and settled it on his head. As he stepped out onto the boardwalk, the sun was bright, the air thin and cold. The dust swirled around his boots. He was a man made of the same grit and silence as the land itself, a solitary figure against a vast, indifferent sky. The steam engine hissed into the station, a great black beast breathing clouds of white into the crisp air. Its arrival was an assault on the senses. The shriek of brakes, the clang of coupling cars, the sudden bloom of voices and activity on the deserted platform. Caleb stood back, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. He observed, cataloged, a family of homesteaders, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and fierce hope. A trio of miners, loud and coarse. A salesman in a bowler hat, his case clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Then, the door of the passenger car opened, and she appeared. She was like a splash of color in a world of brown and gray. Her dress was the deep blue of a twilight sky, finely made but creased and dusted from travel. A matching hat, adorned with a simple ribbon, was perched on a mass of hair the color of warm honey. She paused at the top of the steep metal steps, her gloved hand resting on the rail, her eyes scanning the small crowd with a hopeful anxiety that was as out of place here as she was. Caleb felt an unwelcome jolt, a flicker of something he had long since extinguished. She did not belong here. Everything about her, from the delicate line of her jaw to the polished leather of her little boots, screamed of manicured lawns and gaslit parlors in Philadelphia or Boston. She descended the steps, her movements graceful despite the awkwardness of her long skirts. On the platform, she clutched a small, embroidered reticule and looked around, her initial hope visibly dimming into confusion, then concern. She was searching for someone who was not there. Caleb had seen this scene before, though usually with less elegant protagonists. Promises made in letters often withered under the harsh Wyoming sun. A portly man in a station master's uniform approached her, his expression sympathetic. "Looking for someone, ma'am?" Her voice, when she answered, was clear and cultured, yet threaded with a tremor of unease. "Yes, I am. A Mr. Sterling. He was to meet me." The station master, a man named Abernathy who knew every soul within 50 miles, scratched his head. "Sterling? Can't say I know the name. You sure you got the right town? This here is Redemption." "Oh, yes. I am quite certain," she insisted, her grip on her bag tightening. "He wrote that he owned a ranch just east of town. He sent the ticket himself." Caleb remained where he was, a silent observer in the shadows of the station overhang. He knew every rancher, every landowner, every drifter who had ever laid a claim. There was no Sterling. The woman had been deceived. A familiar, weary anger settled in his gut. The West was full of predators, and she looked like the most vulnerable of prey. He watched as the panic she was holding at bay began to cloud her eyes. The train gave a final, preparatory lurch, its whistle blowing a sharp, impatient blast. It would be pulling out in minutes, leaving her stranded. She looked from the station master's pitying face to the vast, empty horizon beyond the town, and for the first time, she seemed to truly see the place she had come to. The raw, untamed wildness of it. The sheer, crushing scale of the landscape. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction, a small surrender to the dawning, terrible truth of her situation. She was alone. Caleb's feet moved before his mind had fully consented. It was duty, he told himself. Nothing more. He could not leave a woman stranded on his watch. He stepped from the shadows, his boots making a solid, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. Her head snapped toward the noise, and her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, widened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stopped a respectful few feet away, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Thorne, it seems you might be in some trouble." She stared at him, at the silver star pinned to his leather vest, at the stark lines of his face that seemed carved from the surrounding rock. Relief warred with a fresh wave of apprehension. He was an intimidating presence, a man who seemed as untamed as the land he policed. As the final whistle blew and the train began to chug slowly away from the platform, a gust of wind caught her, making her stumble. She lurched forward, her balance lost. Instinct took over. Caleb's hand shot out, catching her by the upper arms. The contact was electric, a shock that jolted through the layers of his self-imposed isolation. Her scent filled his senses, not the cloying perfume he might have expected, but something clean and subtle, like lavender and paper. She was light in his hands, yet solid. Real. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, his strong fingers gripping her arms, her startled face just inches from his. The world narrowed to the space between them, the noise of the departing train fading into a distant hum. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but a flicker of profound determination. It was a look he had not seen, had not allowed himself to be this close to in a very long time. He released her as if her skin were hot to the touch, taking a half step back. The walls of his fortress, which had stood unbreached for years, had just felt the tremor of a siege. Eleanora Vance felt the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her dress long after he had let her go. It was a steadying, solid heat that contrasted sharply with the cold dread pooling in her stomach. She watched the last car of the train disappear around a bend, taking with it her final, fragile link to the life she had left behind. The silence it left in its wake was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the distant caw of a raven. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "There is no Mr. Sterling in this county, ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice flat and devoid of pity. It was a statement of fact, not an offer of condolence. "Whoever sent you that ticket was lying." The words landed like stones. She had suspected at the moment the station master had shaken his head, but hearing it spoken with such finality by this grim-faced lawman made it undeniable. The carefully constructed hope that had carried her 2,000 miles across the country crumbled into dust. The letters, filled with poetic descriptions of the landscape and promises of a respectable, secure life, had been a fiction. A cruel, elaborate trap. I, I don't understand, she whispered, more to herself than to him. His letters were so detailed. He knew of this town of the mountains. Sheriff Thorne's gaze was sharp, analytical. What else did he know, ma'am? Did he know about you? Your circumstances? Eleanora flushed, a wave of shame washing over her. She had been so desperate after her parents' death, so lost in a sea of creditors and condolences, that she had answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride without the caution her father would have advised. She had poured her heart out in her letters, detailing her genteel upbringing, her education, and her sudden, unfortunate solitude. She had been an open book, a foolish, trusting open book. He knew I was alone, she admitted, her voice barely audible, and that my father was a geological surveyor. He worked for the railroad in these territories years ago. At this, the sheriff's expression shifted. The impassive mask slipped, revealing a flicker of sharp, focused interest. Your father's name? Harrison Vance. Caleb's mind worked quickly. Harrison Vance. The name was familiar, connected to old survey maps and rumors of mineral claims that had never been filed. Some had said Vance had found a rich vein of silver in the foothills before he was recalled to the east. It was an old story, mostly forgotten. Until now, this was not a simple, cruel hoax. It was something more calculated. Someone wanted something Harrison Vance had left behind, and they believed his daughter was the key. You need a place to stay, he said, the words coming out as a command rather than a suggestion. He was not a man given to gentle inquiries. The hotel is no place for a woman alone. You could take the spare room at the jailhouse. It's clean, safe. Eleanora stared at him, taken aback. A jailhouse? The idea was both terrifying and, strangely, reassuring. In a town where she could trust no one, the one place dedicated to order, to the law, seemed like the only logical sanctuary. And the man who offered it, for all his brusque and intimidating manner, radiated a sense of unwavering competence. He was a rock in the swirling chaos of her new reality. Thank you, Sheriff. She managed her throat tight. I have a trunk. He gave a curt nod and gestured to a young man who had been lingering nearby, his deputy's badge catching the sun. Miller, fetch the lady's trunk and take it to the office. Then go find Martha Gable. Tell her I need her. The deputy, a fresh-faced boy with earnest eyes, hurried to comply. Caleb then turned his attention back to Eleanora. This way, miss, he did not offer his arm. He simply turned and started walking, expecting her to follow. For a moment, she hesitated, her Philadelphia sensibilities rebelling at the sheer lack of ceremony. But the wind was cold, and the stares of the few remaining townspeople were unervingly curious. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her skirts and followed the broad, straight back of Sheriff Caleb Thorne. The sheriff's office was even more Spartan than she could have imagined. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and strong coffee. The room he led her to was at the back, past the two empty cells. It was small, containing only a narrow iron bedstead with a neatly folded quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. But as he had promised, it was impeccably clean. The floor was swept, and the air, though chilly, was fresh. It's not much, he said, standing in the doorway, his large frame seeming to fill the entire space. But no one will bother you here. It is more than I could have hoped for, Sheriff. Thank you, she said sincerely. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it made her sway. The journey, the shock, the fear, it was all catching up to her. He saw it. His sharp eyes missed nothing. Miller will bring your trunk. Martha will be here soon. She's the doctor's wife. She'll see you have what you need. He paused, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. You'll be safe here, Miss Vance. With another brief nod, he turned and left, pulling the door partially closed behind him, granting her a semblance of privacy. Eleanora sank onto the edge of the cot, the stiff mattress groaning under her weight. The quilt was rough but warm beneath her trembling fingers. Safe. The word echoed in the small, bare room. For the first time since stepping off that train, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. But as she looked around the cell-like room, a new and unsettling thought took root. She had traveled across a continent seeking a home and a partnership, only to find herself a prisoner, however willing, of a man who seemed to be a prisoner himself, locked away inside a fortress of solitude and duty. Later that evening, after Martha Gable had arrived, a whirlwind of brisk efficiency and motherly kindness who brought a hot meal, fresh water, and a barrage of comforting words, Eleonora sat by the pot-belly stove in the main office. The deputy had gone home, and the town outside had fallen into a deep, star-dusted silence. Only she and the sheriff remained, separated by a few feet of wooden floorboards and a chasm of experience. Caleb sat at his desk, cleaning his revolver with meticulous, practiced movements. The soft rasp of the oiled cloth against the steel was the only sound. He had not spoken more than a handful of words to her since her arrival, yet his presence was a constant, solid weight in the room. Eleonora watched the firelight flicker across the hard planes of his face, softening the severity of his expression and casting his eyes in deep shadow. She felt a strange compulsion to break the silence, to understand the man who had so grudgingly offered her sanctuary. "Sheriff," she began, her voice soft in the quiet room. He did not look up, but the rhythmic motion of his hands paused. "Why would someone do such a thing? Lure me all the way out here with a lie?" He finished wiping down the barrel before carefully reassembling the weapon, the clicks of the mechanism precise and final. Only then did he lift his head, his gaze meeting hers across the room. "Greed, Miss Vance. It's the oldest story there is. They think you have something they want. But I have nothing," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her. "My family's name is all that is left. The debts outweighed the estate. That is why she trailed off, unwilling to voice the full depth of her desperation. "It's not what you have now," he corrected, his voice low and even. "It's what they think your father left behind." The story goes that Harrison Vance charted a silver lode in the Rattlesnake Hills. A rich one. He never filed the claim. Some believe the map, or the deed, still exists. Eleonora's mind reeled. A silver mine? It sounded like something from one of the penny dreadfuls her father had so disapproved of. That's absurd. If my father had discovered such a thing, we would have known. He would have provided for us. Maybe he intended to, Caleb said, his eyes holding hers. Or maybe he feared what a discovery like that would attract. Men kill for less out here. The statement hung in the air, cold and sharp. He was not being dramatic. He was merely stating a fact of his world. A log in the stove shifted and collapsed, sending a shower of sparks up the flue. The sudden noise made her jump. The reality of her danger was beginning to sink in. She was not just a jilted bride. She was a target. You said attachments are a weakness," she recalled, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that what you truly believe?" For the first time, a flicker of something raw and unguarded crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant, but she saw it. A deep, profound pain. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames visible through the stove's grate. "I had a wife," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were being dragged from a place of great injury. "And a daughter. Fever took them both one winter for years back. I learned then that everything you love is just something you can lose. A man with nothing to lose is a man who can't be broken." The confession, so stark and unadorned, struck Eleonora with the force of a physical blow. The sheriff's solitude was not a philosophy, it was a scar. A fortress built on the ruins of a shattered heart. Her own loss, the death of her parents, suddenly felt less unique, part of a universal tapestry of grief. In this harsh, silent man, she recognized a fellow survivor. "I am so sorry, Sheriff," she said, her voice thick with genuine empathy. "My parents, they passed within a month of each other last spring. The influenza. I thought my world had ended. I suppose, in a way, it did." He looked back at her then, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, they were no longer just a lawman and a damsel in distress. They were two people who had looked into the abyss of loss and had, somehow, kept standing. A fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them. He saw the steel beneath her refined exterior, and she saw the wounded heart he kept so carefully guarded. "You'll be safe here, Eleonora," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was startlingly intimate. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." He moved to the small cot he used in the office when he was on watch, leaving her by the warmth of the stove. As Eleonora finally retreated to her own small room, she realized the greatest danger in redemption might not be the faceless men who sought a phantom silver mine. It might be the slow, undeniable thawing of the fortress around Sheriff Caleb Thorne's heart and her own. For in his shared vulnerability, she had not found weakness, but a profound and compelling strength. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Eleonora established a small routine within the confines of the jailhouse. She helped Martha Gable with mending, read the few books the doctor's wife could lend her, and took short, chaperoned walks along the main street. She was a curiosity to the townspeople, a delicate bird in a gilded cage, and she felt their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and suspicion. But under the constant, watchful presence of Sheriff Thorne, she was untouched. Caleb, for his part, found his own rigid routines irrevocably altered. Her presence was a quiet disruption, a scent of lavender in his Spartan world of dust and iron. He found himself listening for the soft rustle of her skirts, the low murmur of her voice as she spoke with Martha. He would look up from his paperwork and find her watching the street from the window, her expression thoughtful, and a strange, protective instinct would tighten in his chest. It was an unwelcome, dangerous feeling. He made inquiries, sending a telegram to the marshal in Cheyenne. The answers that came back were unsettling. A man named Silas Blackwood, a ruthless land baron with a reputation for acquiring property through intimidation and violence, had recently been buying up vast tracts of land in the Rattlesnake Hills. Blackwood was known to be thorough. He would not have brought Eleonora all this way without being certain she was the key to what he wanted. One afternoon, as Eleonora was returning from the mercantile with Martha, it happened. Two strangers were lounging outside the saloon, their eyes hard and their clothes dusty from a long ride. They watched her with an unnerving intensity. They fit the description of men known to work for Blackwood. Caleb, who had been watching from his office window, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, on his street. As Eleonora and Martha drew level with the saloon, one of the men deliberately stepped into their path, a leering grin on his face. "Well now, what have we here? You must be the fancy lady from the East we've been hearing about." Martha Gable, a woman not easily intimidated, drew herself up. "You will let us pass, sir." The man ignored her, his eyes fixed on Eleonora. "We have business with you, miss. A Mr. Blackwood would like a word." Before Eleonora could respond, the door of the sheriff's office swung open and Caleb was there, standing on the boardwalk. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply moved with a lethal calm that was more menacing than any overt threat. "The lady has no business with you," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. His hand was not on his gun, but his entire posture was a promise of swift, decisive violence. "Move." The two men exchanged a look. They had heard of Sheriff Thorne. They assessed the situation, the unyielding set of his jaw, the cold fire in his eyes, and seemed to decide this was not the time or place for a confrontation. The first man gave a mock bow. "Whatever you say, Sheriff." "For now," he and his partner smirked, then pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon. Caleb's gaze followed them until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Eleonora. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She was frightened, but she was not cowering. That flicker of determination he had seen on the train platform was burning brighter now. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice harsher than he intended, rough with the adrenaline of the near confrontation. Back in the safety of the office, the air was thick with tension. Martha fussed over Eleonora, but Caleb's attention was fixed on the street. He knew this was just the beginning. Blackwood was testing him, seeing how far he would go to protect her. They work for Silas Blackwood, he said, finally turning from the window. He's the one who wants your father's map. He looked at Eleonora, his expression grim. They believe you have it, do you? Think, Eleonora. Any of your father's old effects? A trunk? A book? A keepsake? Eleonora's mind raced. She had brought so little with her. Her father's books had been sold to pay debts. His surveying equipment was gone. There was only her mother's music box. It was a simple rosewood box, a gift from her father on their 10th anniversary. It was the one thing she had refused to part with. There is a music box, she said slowly. My mother's. My father gave it to her. It's in my trunk. Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides. Show me. She led him to her room and knelt by her trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she retrieved the box. It was polished and smooth in her hands, a tangible link to the happy, secure world she had lost. She handed it to him. Caleb turned it over in his large, capable hands. It seemed impossibly delicate. He examined every inch of it, his touch surprisingly gentle. He ran a thumb over the intricate carving on the lid, then found a tiny, almost invisible seam along the base. Using the edge of his pocket knife, he carefully pried at it. A false bottom. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was not a map, but a small, leather-bound journal. His eyes met hers. Your father was a cautious man. He opened the journal. The pages were filled with Harrison Vance's neat, precise script. It was not a map, but something far more valuable. Detailed geological notes, coordinates, and essays describing a silver lode of astonishing richness. The final entry was dated just before his recall to the east. It read, I dare not file this claim. The discovery is too great, the region too lawless. It would bring a war of greed down on this valley. I will hide this knowledge and pray for a time of peace when it can be unearthed for the good of all, not the enrichment of vipers. I fear for what men like Blackwood would do with such power. My God, Eleonora breathed, staring at her father's words. He had not abandoned the claim. He had hidden it, trying to protect the very people Blackwood now sought to dominate. Her father had seen the danger, and now that danger had found his daughter. Caleb closed the journal, his expression harder than ever. Blackwood won't stop. He knows this exists, and now he knows you're here. He'll tear this town apart to get it. He looked at her, and she saw a conflict in his eyes, a battle between his duty and his deep-seated instinct to remain detached. You are not safe in redemption anymore. I'm taking you out of town. Taking me where? She asked, her heart pounding. To my homestead, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It's north of here, in the foothills. Remote. Defensible. They won't think to look for you there. He did not add that it was the place where Sarah and Lily had died. The place he had not set foot in for 4 years. The place where all his ghosts resided. To take her, there was to invite her into the most wounded part of his soul. It was a desperate move, born not just of strategy, but of a terrifying, burgeoning need to keep her safe at any cost. The fortress was not just being besieged, its gates were being thrown open from the inside. They left under the cover of a moonless night. Caleb had briefed Deputy Miller, leaving him in charge with strict instructions. He packed 2 horses with supplies, food, ammunition, blankets, and led them to the back of the jailhouse. Eleonora, dressed in a practical split skirt and sturdy boots borrowed from Martha, was waiting for him, the small journal tucked securely inside her coat. Her face was a pale oval in the darkness, her eyes wide but steady. Are you ready? He asked, his voice a low murmur. She simply nodded, her trust in him absolute. It was a heavy burden, that trust. He helped her mount her horse, his hands briefly circling her waist to lift her into the saddle. The fleeting contact sent another jolt through him, a reminder of the life and warmth he was trying so hard to hold at arm's length. They rode out of redemption without a word, 2 silent figures swallowed by the immense, breathing darkness of the prairie. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the dusty earth. Caleb led the way, navigating by instinct and memory through the rolling, sage-brushed hills. The air grew colder as they gained elevation, smelling of pine and damp soil. For Caleb, every mile was a journey backward in time. The shape of the ridgeline against the star-dusted sky, the scent of the pines, it was all inextricably linked with Sarah. He had brought her here as a bride, to the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. They had dreamed of a life here, of a family, of a future that stretched out as wide and promising as the valley below. He could almost hear her laughter on the wind, see the light of the lantern in the window he had always looked for when riding home. The memories were knives, twisting in old wounds. He had chosen this place for its isolation, the very quality that had made the grief so unbearable after he had lost them. Now, that same isolation was its greatest asset. Blackwood's men were thugs, not trackers. They would search the roads, the stagecoach lines. They would not expect him to retreat into the heart of his own pain. After 2 hours of hard riding, they crested a final rise. Below them, nestled in a small meadow and sheltered by a stand of tall aspen trees, was the homestead. The cabin was a dark, solid shape against the slightly paler darkness of the meadow grass. A curl of stone chimney stood sentinel at one end. It looked smaller than he remembered and infinitely more lonely. "We're here," he said, his voice hoarse. They dismounted, their bodies stiff from the ride. While Eleonora held the reins, Caleb pushed open the cabin door. It groaned in protest. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, thick with the dust of disuse and the ghosts of memory. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and struck a match. The sudden flare of light illuminated a single room, frozen in time. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, its mattress bare, and in the corner, covered by a dusty canvas sheet, was a small shape he could not bring himself to look at. Lily's cradle. He had built it himself. He moved mechanically, lighting the lantern on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows, but did not warm the profound chill of the room. He could feel Eleonora's presence behind him in the doorway, her hesitation, her silent recognition that this was a sacred, sorrowful place. "I'm sorry to bring you here," he said, his back still to her. There was no other place. "Do not be sorry, Caleb," she said softly, stepping inside. "It's a strong house." He turned to look at her. In the warm lamplight, her face was filled with a deep, quiet compassion that threatened to undo him completely. She was not repulsed by the sorrow that clung to the air. She was not afraid of his ghosts. She was simply there, a steady, living presence in his house of memories. "I'll get a fire going," he said, turning away to busy himself at the hearth. He needed the action, the simple, physical task of laying kindling and striking a spark. "You can take the bed. I'll take the floor." As the first flames began to lick at the dry wood, casting flickering shadows on the walls, a fragile warmth began to seep into the room. Eleonora moved to the window, wiping away a patch of grime with her sleeve. She looked out at the dark, silent meadow. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Peaceful." Caleb paused, a log in his hand. No one had called this place beautiful in 4 years. He had only seen it as a tomb. But through her eyes, for just a moment, he saw it as it had once been, a place of hope, a sanctuary. The external threat had forced them into this shared intimacy, trapping them together in the crucible of his past. He had brought her here to save her from Blackwood, but as he watched her stand in the firelight, her presence a quiet defiance against the cold and the dark, he had the unnerving premonition that it was he who was in greater danger of being saved. The solitude he had mistaken for strength was beginning to feel like what it truly was, a long and lonely vigil, and it was about to be broken. The fire crackled, a cheerful, living sound in the long, silent cabin. It pushed back the physical cold, but the chill of memory remained, a ghost at Caleb's shoulder. He and Eleonora worked in a comfortable, unspoken rhythm, preparing a simple meal of biscuits and bacon from the supplies. He found he was acutely aware of her every movement. The way she tucked a stray strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear, the quiet competence of her hands as she laid out the plates on the dusty table. They ate in near silence, the space between them charged with unspoken thoughts. Caleb felt the cabin's history pressing in on him. He saw Sarah at this table, her face bright with laughter. He saw Lily, a toddler, banging a wooden spoon against the floor. These walls had held so much life. Now, they held only him and this woman from another world, a woman he was sworn to protect, a woman who was steadily, terrifyingly dismantling his defenses. After they ate, Eleonora took the journal from her coat and placed it on the table between them. "What will you do now, Caleb?" "Blackwood. He'll have his men tear your room apart at the jail. When they don't find it, they'll realize you're gone. They'll search the town, then the roads," Caleb explained, his voice low and steady. "It'll buy us a day, maybe two. Then he'll get desperate." "And what is our plan?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. She was not asking for rescue. He realized she was asking for a strategy. She saw herself as a partner in this, not a package to be protected. The thought was both unsettling and deeply admirable. "We wait," he said. "This place is hard to find if you don't know it's here. When he makes his next move in town, Miller will get word to me. We have the advantage of terrain. We have the element of surprise," he paused. "And we have this," he tapped the journal. "This is our leverage. He wants it. That makes him predictable." Eleonora looked around the cabin, at the stark, masculine simplicity of it, a room built for survival, not comfort. Her eyes settled on the canvas-draped shape in the corner. "You lived here with them." It was a statement, not a question. Caleb's jaw tightened. He gave a single, curt nod. She did not press, did not offer empty platitudes. Instead, she rose from her chair and walked to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the flames. "My father used to say that a place remembers," she said softly, her back to him. "That great joy and great sorrow leave an echo in the walls. I think he was right. This house feels full of love, even now." His throat felt tight. No one had spoken of love within these walls for 4 years. He had tried to scrub the very memory of the word from his life. But she said it so simply, so naturally, and the echo she spoke of resonated deep within him. It was, he managed to say the words rough. It was a good life. She turned to face him, her expression full of a sorrow that was not pity, but a shared understanding. "Tell me about them." He wanted to refuse. He wanted to raise the drawbridge and retreat back into the safety of his silence. But looking at her, bathed in the warm firelight, her moss-green eyes filled with genuine empathy, he found he could not. The words, locked away for so long, began to surface. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice strained. "She was a schoolteacher from back east, like you. Came out here with more courage than sense." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She said the sky here made her feel free. We met at a town social. We were married 6 months later. Built this place together." He gestured around the room. "Every log, every stone." He looked down at his hands, remembering the feel of the axe, the satisfaction of building a home for the woman he loved. And Lily, she was born in that bed. She had her mother's smile. She loved the wildflowers that grow in the meadow in spring. Yellow ones. He fell silent, the memories too sharp, too vivid. He had not spoken their names aloud in years. The sound of them in the quiet cabin was both a comfort and an agony. Eleonora listened, her heart aching for him. She saw the story in the lines on his face, in the guarded pain in his eyes. She saw the fortress he had built and understood, for the first time, the terrible cost of its construction. "They sound wonderful, Caleb," she said, her voice gentle. He looked up, and his eyes were raw. "They were, and I couldn't save them. A sheriff, a man who was supposed to protect people, and I couldn't protect my own family from a fever." The self-recrimination in his voice was a canyon of guilt he had been living in for years. "You can't stop a fever with a gun, Caleb," she said softly, taking a step closer. "You can't fight sickness like you fight an outlaw. It's not a failing to be unable to do the impossible." Her logic was simple, irrefutable, but it was a truth he had never allowed himself to accept. He had wrapped himself in guilt as a shield, believing he deserved the punishment of solitude. Her words were a direct challenge to the very foundation of his penance. A log in the fire popped, breaking the spell. Caleb stood abruptly, the intimacy of the moment becoming too much to bear. "It's late. You should get some sleep." He moved toward the door, needing air, needing distance. "I'll take the first watch." He stepped out into the cold night air, pulling the door closed behind him. He leaned against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin he had built for Sarah, and stared up at the indifferent stars. He had brought Eleonora here to protect her, but in sharing his deepest wound, he had given her a weapon of compassion, and she was using it to systematically dismantle the walls he had spent 4 years building. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with Silas Blackwood and his men. The greatest threat was not the one riding toward them, but the one already inside the walls of his heart. The next day dawned cold and clear. A thin layer of frost coated the meadow, glittering like diamond dust in the early morning sun. The beauty of it was sharp, painful. Caleb had been awake most of the night, circling the cabin, his senses on high alert, his mind in turmoil. When he came back inside, Eleonora was already awake, folding the quilt on the bed with neat, precise movements. She had braided her hair, and in the simple, practical style, he saw a woman preparing for a siege, not a guest awaiting rescue. "Any sign of them?" she asked, her voice calm. "Not yet. The valley is quiet," he replied, pouring them both coffee from the pot he had brewed over the fire. He handed her a cup, their fingers brushing. The brief contact was enough to make him pull his hand back, as if burned. They spent the day in a state of tense anticipation. Caleb showed her how to load and fire his Winchester, his touch impersonal and professional as he adjusted her stance and grip. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his tone all business. "I don't expect there to be trouble, but we plan for the worst." She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a quick study. Her first shot was wide, the recoil jarring her shoulder. Her second was closer. By the end of the lesson, she could reliably hit a tin can balanced on a fence post 50 yards away. He watched her, a strange mix of pride and dread filling his chest. He was teaching her to survive in his world, and with every lesson, she seemed to fit more seamlessly into it, erasing the line between the refined lady from the East and the resilient woman of the West. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, he saw it. A flicker of movement on the far ridge, the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel. They had been found. "Inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now." Eleonora did not hesitate. She grabbed the spare rifle and a box of cartridges and ran into the cabin. Caleb followed, barring the heavy wooden door and moving to the small window. He peered through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders were making their way down into the valley, moving cautiously. Blackwood's men, Hank and Pike, the 2 from the saloon, and a third man he didn't recognize. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. 3 of them. Eleonora took up a position at the other window, her face pale but resolute. The knuckles of her hands were white where she gripped the rifle stock. The cabin, once a sanctuary of memory, had become a fortress. "They'll try to talk first," Caleb predicted. "Try to get us to come out." As if on cue, a voice called out from the edge of the meadow. "Thorne, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the girl. Blackwood just wants what's his. Send her out with the journal, and you can walk away." Caleb did not answer. Silence was a weapon. It bred uncertainty. "Don't be a fool, Sheriff," the voice Hanks called again, closer this time. "There's 3 of us. You can't protect her." Caleb glanced at Eleonora. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window. He saw her fear, but beneath it, he saw the same iron will he'd glimpsed on the train platform. She was not going to break. "Stay down," he whispered. The first shot came without warning. A bullet splintered the wood of the window frame near Caleb's head, showering him with slivers of pine. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of noise and violence. Gunfire echoed through the small valley, the sharp crack of rifles a brutal intrusion on the peaceful landscape. Caleb returned fire with deadly efficiency, his shots carefully placed, designed to keep their heads down, to make them waste ammunition. He was a master of this kind of fight, his movements economical, his mind cold and clear. He was so focused on the battle that he almost didn't notice Eleanor's movement. She had crept to the back of the cabin, to the small root cellar door hidden beneath a rug. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "The cellar. Does it lead outside?" He shook his head. "No, it's just a storage cellar," then he remembered. "But there's a ventilation shaft. Small. It comes out behind that stand of aspens." An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in her eyes. "They're focused on the front of the cabin. If I can create a diversion from the side, it might give you an opening." "No," he said instantly, his voice sharp. "It's too dangerous. You stay here. You said it yourself. We have to plan for the worst," she argued, her voice rising with a passion he had never heard before. "They think I'm a helpless victim. They won't be expecting me. Give me the chance to be more than just something you have to protect." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the fierce set of her jaw. She was right. In his drive to protect her, he had underestimated her. She was not a liability. She was a partner. It was a terrifying, revolutionary thought. "All right," he conceded, his heart pounding. "But you fire one shot, just one, to draw their attention. Then you get back inside." "Understood." She nodded, a look of fierce gratitude on her face. He helped her lift the heavy cellar door. She slipped into the darkness below, the spare rifle clutched in her hand. He closed the door over her, his hand lingering on the wood. He had just sent the most important person in his world into danger. The irony was savage. He returned to the window, his senses stretched to their breaking point. He waited. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then, from the woods to the right of the cabin, came the sharp crack of a rifle. As he had predicted, two of Blackwood's men, Hank and the third man, spun toward the sound, caught completely by surprise. "What the hell was that?" Hank yelled. She got out. It was the opening Caleb needed. As they were distracted, he took careful aim at the third man, who was most exposed. He squeezed the trigger. The man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. At the same time, Pike, the remaining gunman, took the opportunity to make a desperate rush for the cabin's blind spot near the door. Caleb spun from the window, knowing what was coming next. The heavy wooden door shuddered as Pike slammed his shoulder against it. "It's over, Thorne," Pike bellowed from outside. Caleb raised his rifle, aiming it at the door, waiting for the wood to splinter. But before Pike could strike again, the cellar door behind Caleb flew open. Eleanora emerged, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes blazing. She was not holding the rifle. She was holding a heavy iron skillet from the hearth. Before Caleb could react, she moved to the main door, her movements swift and silent. She stood to the side of it, the skillet raised like a weapon. "Hit it again," she yelled, her voice a defiant challenge. Pike, likely thinking it was Caleb taunting him, let out a roar of fury and slammed his body against the door one more time. The bolt, weakened by the impacts, finally gave way. The door flew open, and Pike stumbled into the room, his gun raised, his face a mask of triumph. He never saw her. Eleanora swung the heavy skillet with all her might. The sound of iron connecting with bone was sickeningly loud. Pike's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Caleb stared from the unconscious man on the floor to Eleanora, who stood over him, breathing heavily, the skillet still clutched in her hand. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and her face was fierce and alive. She was magnificent. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole his breath washed over him. It was not just relief. It was awe. It was a profound, earth-shattering love. In that moment, he saw the absolute folly of his life's creed. Survival was not a solitary pursuit. Strength was not found in isolation. It was found here, in this cabin, with this woman fighting together. The sound of a horse galloping away broke the spell. Hank, seeing his two partners taken down, was making a run for it. Caleb let him go. The fight was over. He crossed the room to Eleonora, his legs unsteady. He reached out and gently took the skillet from her hand, setting it on the table. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking the smudges of dirt on her cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. "I am now." He looked into her eyes, and the walls he had so carefully maintained for 4 long years crumbled into dust. The fear of loss was still there, a cold shadow in the back of his mind, but it was eclipsed by a much greater fear, the thought of living another day without her. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, the words raw and torn from the deepest part of him. "When you went out there, the thought of something happening to you," he couldn't finish. The very idea was a physical pain, sharper than any bullet. "You told me I wouldn't survive alone," she said softly, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, over his rapidly beating heart. I think perhaps you were talking about yourself, Caleb." She was right. He had been a dead man walking for 4 years, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. She had brought him back. She had shown him that a heart could break and still learn to beat again. "Don't leave," he said, the plea stark and simple. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. Stay here, with me." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of gratitude and a fierce, undeniable love. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long, lonely exile. She responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The cabin, which had been a place of sorrow and memory, was filled with a new and powerful life. The ghosts were silent. In the aftermath of violence and fear, amidst the dust and the danger, Caleb Thorne finally understood. He had not been surviving. He had only been waiting. The morning after the attack, the valley was preternaturally still. The wounded man, his leg bandaged, was tied up in the root cellar, while Pike remained unconscious, bound securely by the hearth. Caleb had spent the remainder of the night holding Eleonora, not sleeping, but simply absorbing the reality of her presence, the warmth of her body a tangible anchor against the pull of his old grief. The declaration, torn from him in the heat of the moment, had changed everything. The silence between them now was not one of distance, but of profound, shared understanding. As the sun crested the ridge, casting long shadows across the meadow, Caleb knew they could not stay. Hank would have ridden straight back to Blackwood. A larger, more determined force would be on its way. "We have to go back to redemption," he said, his voice low as he stirred the embers of the fire back to life. "The fight needs to end there. On my terms." Eleonora, who was watching him from the bed where he had insisted she rest, nodded. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet resolve. "What will you do?" "Blackwood has broken the law. Attempted murder, kidnapping by proxy. I'm going to arrest him," Caleb stated, the words as solid as granite. "This ends now, not just for us, for this whole valley." He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was the law, and he would see it done. They rode back to town with Pike slung over his horse and the other man tied to his saddle horn. It was a slow, grim procession. Caleb's mind was a whirlwind of strategy, but beneath the tactical thoughts, a single, powerful certainty pulsed. He was no longer fighting just to survive. He was fighting for a future, for a life with a woman riding beside him. Their arrival and redemption caused a stir. Deputy Miller rushed out of the office, his face a mixture of relief and alarm. The townspeople, who had been watching the drama unfold from a distance, now gathered on the boardwalks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to a grudging respect. The sheriff had not run. He had faced a threat and returned with prisoners. After locking his captives in the cells, Caleb turned to Eleonora in the quiet of his office. The room that had once been his fortress now felt like a temporary shelter. His true home was the homestead, but only if she was in it. He took her hands in his. They were smudged with dirt and calloused from gripping the rifle, and they were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "Eleonora," he began, his voice suddenly uncertain. He could face down gunmen without flinching, but this was harder. What I said back at the cabin, I meant every word. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't either, Caleb, she said softly, her eyes searching his. He took a deep breath. This is no place to ask, and the timing is all wrong, but I have to. I can't risk waiting. He reached into the small pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring, intricately carved with forget-me-nots. This was my mother's. She gave it to my father, who gave it to me to give to the woman I knew I couldn't live without. I thought I'd lost that right. I thought that part of my life was over. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. You showed me I was wrong. You walked into my life and made me feel alive again. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. Eleanora Vance, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in this valley? Tears welled in Eleanora's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She had come to this harsh land seeking security, a refuge from a life that had fallen apart. She had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a partner, a home in the heart of a man who believed he had nothing left to give. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Oh, Caleb, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He sealed the promise with a kiss, a tender, heartfelt kiss that was a world away from the desperate one they had shared in the cabin. It was a kiss of beginnings, of futures, of two solitary souls finding their strength in each other. The tender moment was broken by the sound of shouting from the street. Deputy Miller burst in, his face pale. Sheriff, it's Blackwood. He's riding into town with a dozen men. They're armed for a war. Caleb's expression hardened. He released Eleanora, his hand lingering on hers for a moment. He was no longer just a man in love. He was a lawman with a town to protect. He strapped on his gun belt, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. Stay inside, he commanded Eleanora. Bar the door. But as he turned to leave, he saw the townspeople. They were not running. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harris, stood on his porch with a shotgun. Jed, the saloon owner, had a rifle propped on his bar. Even a station master, Abernathy, held an old cavalry pistol. They had seen Caleb stand, had seen his commitment. This was their town, too. They were not going to let Blackwood take it. A slow, grim smile touched Caleb's lips. He was not alone. He had never been, not really. He had just been too blind with grief to see it. He strode out onto the main street, Deputy Miller at his side. He walked to the center of the dusty road and waited. Blackwood and his men reined in at the far end of the street, a line of grim-faced riders. Thorne, Blackwood bellowed, his face contorted with rage. This is your last chance. Give me the girl and the journal, and I'll let you live. Silas Blackwood. Caleb's voice rang out, clear and steady, carrying across the tense silence. You are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy. Lay down your arms and surrender. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You in what army, Sheriff? This one, Caleb said simply. And as he spoke, the doors and windows of redemption filled with armed citizens, their weapons all pointing at Blackwood's men. The land baron's face fell, his arrogance replaced by disbelief. He had expected to fight one man. He was facing a whole town. The standoff was brief. Blackwood's hired guns were mercenaries, not martyrs. Faced with overwhelming odds, they slowly, grudgingly, lowered their weapons. Blackwood, his face a mask of fury and defeat, was the last to surrender. Caleb and his deputy disarmed them, the community of redemption watching in grim satisfaction. The threat that had hung over the valley was broken. As Caleb led a shackled Silas Blackwood toward the jail, he caught Eleanora's eye. She was standing on the boardwalk, her hand with his mother's ring resting over her heart. The look that passed between them was a silent acknowledgement of all they had overcome and all they had to look forward to. The town was safe. The future was theirs. The lonely fortress of Sheriff Caleb Thorne had fallen, replaced by a home, a community, and the promise of a shared life. 2 years later, the homestead was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a home, vibrant and alive. The cabin had been expanded, a new wing added with sturdy timber Caleb had felled himself. The windows had glass panes now, and cheerful curtains, sewn by Eleonora, fluttered in the breeze. The cold hearth was a distant memory, replaced by a fireplace that was rarely without a warm, crackling fire. The meadow, once a silent expanse, was now fenced, containing a small herd of healthy cattle. The ranch was thriving. Eleonora stood on the newly built porch, a basket of laundry on her hip. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off the train in a fine blue dress. She wore a simple, practical gingham dress, her face lightly tanned by the sun, her hands capable and strong. The Wyoming sky had, as Sarah Thorne had once believed, made her feel free. It had stripped away the unnecessary layers of her old life and revealed the resilient, capable woman she had always been. A cry from inside the cabin drew her attention. She smiled, setting the basket down, and went inside. In the corner of the main room, in the very cradle Caleb had once covered with a dusty sheet, lay their daughter. She was a year old, with her mother's moss-green eyes and a tuft of dark hair like her father's. They had named her Hope. Eleonora lifted the baby into her arms, her heart swelling with a love so profound it was a physical presence. Hope gurgled happily, her tiny hands reaching for the silver ring on Eleanor's finger. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the moment their new life had truly begun. Caleb came in from the barn, stamping the dust from his boots. The lines of grief and solitude that had once seemed permanently etched onto his face had softened. Laughter came more easily to him now, and his eyes, when they rested on his wife and daughter, were filled with a deep, quiet contentment. He was still the sheriff of redemption, respected and admired, but his true jurisdiction was here, within the walls of this home. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Eleonora and the baby, enveloping them in a hug that smelled of leather, hay, and sunshine. He kissed the top of Hope's head, then rested his cheek against Eleanor's hair. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Everything is perfect," she replied, leaning back against the solid strength of his chest. She was carrying their second child, a secret she planned to tell him tonight as they watched the stars from the porch. Their life was growing, expanding, filling the once empty spaces with love and laughter. That evening, as the sun bled fiery color across the western horizon, they sat together on the porch steps. Hope was asleep in her cradle inside, and the valley was settling into its evening quiet. The air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. It was a peace they had fought for, a peace they had built together. Caleb took her hand, his thumb tracing the forget-me-nots on his mother's ring. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "Philadelphia? The life you left behind?" Eleonora looked out at the vast, beautiful landscape, at the mountains turning purple in the twilight. She thought of the gaslit parlors, the stifling social rules, the loneliness that had haunted her even in a crowded city. She had not been living then. She had been waiting. "I left nothing behind that I truly needed," she said, turning to look at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "Everything I could ever want is right here." He smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile that reached his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, familiar kiss full of shared history and future promise. The man who had believed survival was a solitary pursuit had found his life in a partnership. The woman who had arrived lost and alone had found her home. Together, they had defied the odds, stared down their ghosts, and built a new world from the ruins of the old. Here, in the heart of the wild, untamed West, they had found their redemption.